Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where shadows stretch a little longer and the silence feels alive. Tonight we step into the Appalachian Cemeteries. Not the ones on the maps, but the hidden plots behind broken fences and creeping ivy. Locals talk of footsteps on empty paths, of names chiseled into stone no one remembers. Every tale you'll hear tonight is rooted in truth, legend, or lived experience. So if you're brave enough, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're just passing the rusted gate now. The ground softens beneath our feet, and somewhere up ahead, something's waiting. Story 1. Cursed Appalachian Doll. My 6-year-old daughter, this teddy bear, spoke to me in a language that died before America was born. And it all started when I moved that damn cornhusk doll. I found it sitting on a child's grave in the old Holbrook Cemetery in eastern Kentucky. A twisted thing made from dried corn husks and rotting fabric. The headstone belonged to Mary Elizabeth Caldwell, age 7, died 1847. Someone had placed the doll against the marker like an offering, its hollow black eyes staring up at the October sky. I should have left it alone. God knows I should have walked away. But my daughter Emma had been asking for an old-fashioned doll for weeks, inspired by some historical documentary she had seen at school. The thing looked handmade, probably worth a few dollars at an antique shop. What harm could there be in taking something that was just going to rot in the weather? The moment I picked it up, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in white puffs, and every bird in the cemetery went silent at the same time. The doll felt wrong in my hands, heavier than it should have been, and warm despite the sudden cold. But Emma would love it, and after losing my job at the coal plant, I could not afford to buy her much for her birthday. I drove home with the doll sitting on my passenger seat, its face turned toward the window like it was watching the landscape roll by. Every time I glanced over, I could swear its expression had changed slightly. The stitched mouth seemed to curve into different shapes, and those black button eyes appeared to track my movements. Emma was thrilled when I gave it to her that evening. She named it Abigail and immediately began playing house, setting up tea parties and brushing its stringy cornhusk hair. My wife Sarah was less enthusiastic, wrinkling her nose at the musty smell that clung to the doll like grave dirt. But Emma was happy, and that was worth Sarah's disapproval. The first strange thing happened 3 days later. I woke up at 2 a.m. to find Emma's bedroom door wide open, spilling yellow light into the hallway. She was sitting on her bed, having an animated conversation with someone I could not see. When I got closer, I realized she was talking to all her toys, which were arranged in a perfect circle around her. Her teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, was propped up directly across from Emma, and I could swear I heard a tiny voice responding to her questions. Not Emma's voice in a different pitch, like kids usually do when playing with toys. This was something else entirely. Scratchy and ancient, speaking words that sounded like English but wrong somehow. I stood in the doorway, listening to that impossible conversation, until Emma noticed me and climbed up. When I asked who she was talking to, she just smiled and said Abigail had been teaching her and her toys some old songs. The cornhusk doll sat in the center of the toy circle, its black eyes fixed on me with what looked like malicious intelligence. Over the next week, things escalated. Emma's other toys began moving on their own, rearranging themselves when no one was looking. I would come home from job hunting to find her stuffed animals lined up along the hallway like they were marching somewhere. Her toy piano would play simple melodies in the middle of the night, always the same haunting tune that sounded like a funeral dirge. But it was the voices that really terrified me. Emma's toys had started talking when she was not around, whispering to each other in that same ancient dialect I had first heard from Mr. Buttons. I caught fragments of conversation through her bedroom door, words that made my skin crawl even though I could not understand them. Sarah thought I was having a breakdown from job stress, but I knew what I was hearing. The cornhusk doll was somehow infecting Emma's other toys, bringing them to life with whatever dark energy it carried. And Emma was changing too, speaking in old-fashioned phrases and humming that funeral tune constantly. I decided to research the doll's history, driving back to the Holbrook Cemetery to look for clues. The groundskeeper was an old man named Pete who had been caring for the graves for 40 years. When I described the doll, his face went pale as winter sky. According to Pete, the doll had been appearing on graves throughout Appalachian Kentucky for decades. Always on children's headstones, always made from the same twisted corn husks and rotting fabric. People who moved it reported the same phenomena I was experiencing. Toys coming to life, children speaking in ancient tongues, families torn apart by something they could not understand. The doll was connected to a tragedy that happened in 1847, the same year Mary Elizabeth Caldwell died. A woman named Granny Hutchins had been accused of practicing witchcraft, specifically cursing the local children who had been dying of a mysterious illness. The townspeople dragged her from her cabin and hanged her from an old oak tree, but not before she promised that the children would never rest in peace. Granny Hutchins had been known for making cornhusk dolls, selling them at the local market to feed her family. After her death, those dolls began appearing on the graves of the children who had died from the illness. Anyone who disturbed them found their own children afflicted with nightmares, speaking in tongues, and worse. The doll was not just a toy. It was a vessel for Granny Hutchins' revenge, a way for her to reach across the centuries and continue tormenting the descendants of those who had murdered her. And I had brought it into my home, exposed my daughter to a curse that had been claiming victims for over a century and a half. I raced back home to find Emma in her room, surrounded by every toy she owned. They were all moving now, dancing in slow circles while that funeral tune played from sources I could not identify. Mr. Buttons was standing upright on his hind legs, his button eyes glowing with inner light as he spoke in Granny Hutchins' voice. Emma sat in the center of it all, holding the cornhusk doll and rocking back and forth. When she looked up at me, her eyes had changed. They were older, filled with a hatred that no 6-year-old should be capable of feeling. When she spoke, it was in that same ancient dialect, words that burned my ears and made my vision blur. I grabbed the doll from Emma's hands, ignoring her screams of protest. The thing felt like it was on fire, searing my palms as I carried it out to my truck. I could hear Sarah calling after me, asking what was wrong, but I could not stop to explain. The doll had to go back where it came from before it claimed Emma completely. The drive to Holbrook Cemetery took forever, with the doll writhing in my hands like a living thing. It whispered threats in that dead language, promising terrible fates for my family if I did not return it to Emma immediately. By the time I reached Mary Elizabeth Caldwell's grave, my hands were blistered and bleeding. I placed the doll back against the headstone and stepped away, waiting for something to happen. The whispers stopped immediately, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me for weeks finally lifted. The cornhusk doll went still, once again looking like nothing more than an old toy left by a grieving parent. When I got home, Emma was back to normal, playing quietly with toys that stayed where she put them. She had no memory of the past week, no recollection of ancient songs or midnight conversations. Sarah thought I had suffered some kind of nervous breakdown, but she was relieved that whatever had been wrong with our family seemed to have passed. I never told them the truth about the cornhusk doll. How could I explain that we had been visited by the vengeful spirit of a woman hanged for witchcraft over a century ago? That our daughter had been chosen as a vessel for Granny Hutchins' eternal rage? They would have had me committed, but I still drive by Holbrook Cemetery sometimes, checking to make sure the doll remains where I left it. It always does, sitting patiently against Mary Elizabeth Caldwell's headstone, waiting for the next parent desperate enough to take it home. The curse of Granny Hutchins lives on, passed from generation to generation through that twisted cornhusk vessel. If you ever find yourself in an old Appalachian cemetery and see a handmade doll on a child's grave, leave it alone. Some gifts from the past are too dangerous to accept, and some grudges are too old to die. The cursed Appalachian doll is still out there, still spreading its infection from toy to child to family, still carrying out Granny Hutchins' promise that the innocent would never rest in peace. The dead remember their grievances far longer than the living remember their crimes. Story 2. Light that leads you astray. The warm, golden light dancing between the trees seemed like salvation when I realized I had been hiking in circles for 3 hours. But salvation was the last thing it had in mind for me. I was 8 miles deep in the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina when my GPS died and my compass started spinning like a broken toy. What should have been a simple day hike to clear my head after another brutal week of unemployment had turned into a nightmare of wrong turns and overgrown trails. The sun was setting fast, and I could feel panic creeping up my throat like bile. That was when I saw the light. It bobbed gently about 50 yards ahead, weaving between the oak trees with the easy rhythm of someone carrying a lantern. My first thought was relief flooding through my chest like warm whiskey. Another hiker, maybe a park ranger, someone who could point me back toward the main trail. I called out, but got no response except for the light pausing momentarily before continuing its slow dance through the forest. I followed, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over fallen logs in my desperation to catch up. But no matter how fast I moved, The light stayed the same distance ahead, always just out of reach but never disappearing entirely. It seemed almost playful, the way it would pause at trail junctions until I caught up, then move on just as I got close enough to see what was carrying it. After 20 minutes of this deadly game of follow the leader, I realized something was wrong. The light never flickered like a real lantern would. It never dimmed when branches passed in front of it. And most disturbing of all, it cast no shadows on the trees around it, as if it existed in some realm that barely touched our own. But I kept following anyway. What choice did I have? The alternative was spending the night alone in the mountains with no shelter, no food, and temperatures dropping into the 30s. At least the light was leading me somewhere, even if I was starting to suspect that somewhere might not be safety. The terrain grew rougher as we climbed deeper into the wilderness. I found myself scrambling over boulders and crossing streams that did not appear on any trail map I had ever seen. The light led me through places where no human foot should have tread for decades, past trees so old their trunks were wider than my truck. That was when I started noticing the other lights. At first, just glimpses in my peripheral vision. Tiny sparks floating between distant trees, winking in and out like fireflies. But as the darkness deepened, more appeared, until the entire forest around me was alive with dancing points of light. They moved with purpose, converging on my location from all directions, and I began to understand that I was not being rescued. I was being herded. The main light ahead of me pulsed brighter, as if sensing my growing awareness of the trap. It began moving faster, forcing me to stumble and run to keep up. Behind me, I could hear the other lights closing in, accompanied by sounds that made my blood freeze. Footsteps that did not quite match human rhythm. Whispers in a language that sounded like wind through dead leaves. I burst into a clearing and stopped short, my breath coming in ragged gasps. In the center of the open space sat the ruins of an old homestead, barely visible in the starlight. Stone foundations marked where walls had once stood, and a single chimney rose into the night sky like an accusing finger. Wild roses had grown over everything, their thorns glinting like teeth in the darkness. The light that had been leading me settled over the ruins, hovering above what must have been the front door. In its glow, I could see other things scattered among the stones. Bones, bleached white by decades of weather, scraps of fabric that might once have been clothing, and everywhere, the sweet smell of decay mixed with the perfume of those wild roses. I tried to back away, but the other lights had formed a complete circle around the clearing. They pulsed in unison now, like a heartbeat made of pure light, and in their glow I could see shapes moving between the trees. Tall figures in old-fashioned clothes, their faces hidden in shadow, all walking slowly toward the ruins where I stood trapped. That was when I heard the crying. A child, his voice, thin and desperate, calling from somewhere inside the ruined homestead. Not words, just pure anguish that cut through the night air like a blade. The main light began to move again, floating deeper into the ruins, and I understood with horrible clarity what it wanted me to find. I followed the light past the foundation stones, past the scattered bones and rotting fabric, to what had once been the back of the house. There, hidden beneath a tangle of rose vines and fallen timber, was a small depression in the earth. A child. This grave, unmarked and forgotten, where someone very young had been laid to rest over a century ago. The crying stopped. The lights went out all at once, plunging the clearing into absolute darkness. And in that darkness, I heard footsteps approaching from every direction. I ran. Blind and panicked, I crashed through the forest with no thought except escape. Branches tore at my face and clothes. Rocks sent me sprawling. But I did not stop until I saw genuine electric lights in the distance. The parking area where I had left my truck, somehow only a quarter mile from the ruins that should have been miles deeper in the wilderness. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, telling myself I had gotten lost and let my imagination run wild. But the research I did over the next few days painted a different picture entirely. In 1847, a settler named Thomas Whitmore had built a homestead in what was now the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He lived there with his 7-year-old daughter Sarah after his wife died in childbirth. According to local records, Sarah vanished one autumn evening while picking berries near the house. Thomas spent weeks searching for her, carrying a lantern through the forest night after night, calling her name until his voice gave out. They found his body that winter, frozen to death beside a stream 3 miles from his home, the lantern still clutched in his hands. Sarah was never found, but locals reported seeing strange lights in the forest for years afterward. Lights that seemed to beckon to lost travelers, promising safety but delivering only deeper wilderness. The homestead was abandoned and eventually forgotten, swallowed by the forest that Thomas Whitmore had tried so hard to tame. But the lights continued to appear, and hikers continued to disappear. Always the same pattern. Someone would get lost on the trails, see a friendly light, and follow it deeper into the mountains than they had ever intended to go. Most were found eventually, days later and miles from where they should have been, with no clear memory of how they had gotten there. But some were never seen again, joining Thomas and Sarah Whitmore in whatever gray realm exists between the world of the living and the endless search for something that can never be found. I was one of the lucky ones. Something about that child's grave had broken the spell, allowed me to escape the trap that had been claiming victims for over a century and a half. But I know the light is still out there, still dancing between the trees, still offering hope to lost souls who do not realize they are being led astray. The Great Smoky Mountains are full of legends about mysterious lights and vanished travelers. Most people dismiss them as folklore, stories to tell around campfires to give tourists a thrill. But I know better now. I know that some lights in the wilderness are not meant to guide you home. They are meant to make sure you never leave. If you ever find yourself lost in those ancient mountains and see a warm, golden light bobbing between the trees, do not follow it. Turn around and walk the other way, even if it means spending the night in the cold and dark. Because Thomas Whitmore is still searching for his daughter, and he will gladly add you to his eternal quest rather than let you escape the wilderness that claimed them both so long ago. Some fathers never give up looking for their lost children, and some searches are far too dangerous for the living to join. Story 3. Candlelit Vigil of Corbin Cabin. The candle in Nay Corbin's window has been burning for 97 years, even though the National Park Service boarded up her cabin in 1935 and removed all the furniture. What I discovered during 3 nights watching that impossible flame changed everything I thought I knew about motherhood, loss, and the lengths a woman will go to protect her child. I am a paranormal investigator, not the TV kind with fancy equipment and dramatic reveals, but a researcher who documents unexplained phenomena in America's national parks. Shenandoah hired me after receiving dozens of visitor reports about a mysterious light appearing in an abandoned cabin near the Corbin family cemetery. Every October 15th, the same date Nay Corbin died in childbirth in 1927, hikers reported seeing candlelight flickering in the cabin's front window. The reports were consistent across decades. A single flame, visible from the cemetery where Nay and her unnamed infant daughter were buried together. Park rangers had investigated repeatedly, finding the cabin empty and secure, all windows boarded, no possible source for the light. Yet every year on the anniversary of her death, the candle appeared. I arrived at Corbin Hollow on October 13th, 2 days before the annual sighting. The area had been part of Shenandoah National Park since the 1930s, when the government relocated hundreds of mountain families to create the preserve. Most of the old cabins had been demolished, but a few remained as historical exhibits. The Corbin cabin wasn't one of them. Nay's home sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick woods, accessible only by an overgrown trail that most tourists never found. The structure was typical of Appalachian mountain cabins built in the early 1900s. Rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, and a single room with a sleeping loft. Board and batten shutters covered every window, secured with heavy padlocks that showed no signs of tampering. The family cemetery lay 50 yards downhill from the cabin, marked by a few weathered headstones and several unmarked fieldstone markers. Nay Corbin's grave was easy to identify, the only one with a date of death in 1927. The inscription was simple: Nay Corbin, age 19, called home. Beside her larger stone was a smaller marker, blank except for the words, infant daughter. What struck me immediately was the positioning. From Nay's grave, you had a perfect view of the cabin, his front window. Even with the shutters closed, you could see exactly where the mysterious candle would appear. It was as if the burial site had been chosen specifically to maintain a visual connection between mother and home. I spent my first day researching Nay's story in the park's historical archives. What I found was a tragedy that had been largely forgotten, buried in government relocation records and family oral histories that few people bothered to preserve. Nay Corbin had been married at 16 to a man 20 years her senior, a common arrangement in the isolated mountain communities of the 1920s. Her husband William worked as a logger, leaving Nay alone in the cabin for weeks at a time while he followed timber crews through the mountain. When she became pregnant at 18, William was away on a job in West Virginia, not expected to return until after the baby was due. Nay went into labor alone on October 15, 1927, during an early winter storm that had dumped 2 feet of snow on the mountains. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the rough trails were impassable. She delivered her daughter by herself in the cabin, a single room, but something went wrong during the birth. The medical examiner's report, filed weeks later when William finally returned, described complications from a breech birth and severe bleeding. Nay had managed to deliver a healthy baby girl, but she died from blood loss hours later. The infant survived 3 days before succumbing to exposure and starvation, too young to survive without her mother's milk. William found both bodies when he returned from West Virginia, his wife and daughter frozen in the cabin where they had died alone and terrified. He buried them together in the family plot and abandoned the property within months, unable to live with the guilt of leaving his pregnant wife to face childbirth without help. But the historical record was incomplete. There were details that didn't make sense, inconsistencies that suggested the official story wasn't entirely accurate. On October 14th, the day before the anniversary, I set up my equipment in the Corbin Cemetery with a clear view of the cabin. I brought night vision cameras, digital recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors, hoping to document whatever phenomenon occurred the next evening. As darkness fell, the temperature began dropping faster than weather conditions could explain. By 10 p.m., my breath was visible in white puffs despite the mild October weather. The woods around the cabin fell unnaturally silent, no insect sounds or animal movement, as if every living thing had fled the area. That's when I heard the baby crying, faint at first, barely audible above the wind through the trees, but unmistakably the sound of an infant in distress. The crying seemed to come from the direction of the cabin, growing louder and more desperate as midnight approached. I checked my recording equipment, but the devices detected nothing. Whatever I was hearing wasn't producing sound waves that technology could capture. At exactly 11:47 p.m., a light appeared in the cabin's front window. Not the steady glow of an electric bulb or the harsh beam of a flashlight, but the warm, flickering illumination of a candle flame. The light was visible through the boarded shutters, somehow passing through solid wood as if the barriers didn't exist. The flame danced and wavered like any normal candle, casting moving shadows against the interior walls. But the cabin had been empty for decades. There was no furniture, no fixtures, no possible source for the light I was watching. I approached the structure carefully, expecting the phenomenon to disappear as I got closer. Instead, the candle burned brighter, and I could see more details through the impossible transparency of the boarded windows. Inside the cabin, furnished as it would have been in 1927, was Nay Corbin. She sat in a wooden chair beside a small table, the candle positioned to provide maximum light. In her arms was a bundle of blankets, and she was performing the gentle rocking motions of a mother soothing a baby. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that made my blood run cold. Nay's dress was soaked with blood from the waist down, dark stains that looked wet and fresh despite the decades since her death. Her face was pale with the pallor of someone who had lost too much blood, and her movements had the careful deliberation of a person fighting to remain conscious. She was dying, had been dying for 97 years, but she refused to let go because her baby needed her. The infant in her arms was barely visible, just a suggestion of a small form wrapped in blankets. But I could hear her clearly now, the hungry cries of a newborn who needed feeding and warmth. Nay sang softly as she rocked, a lullaby I didn't recognize, her voice growing weaker with each verse. This wasn't just a ghostly reenactment of Nay's final hours. This was an ongoing struggle, a mother using sheer willpower to stay alive long enough to care for her child, even though both of them were already dead. I watched through the night as Nay tended to her daughter with infinite patience and love. She attempted to breastfeed, though she had no milk to give. She changed diapers that didn't exist, comforted cries that only she could fully hear. Every few hours, she would stand and walk to the window, looking out toward the cemetery as if expecting someone to come help her. As dawn approached, the scene began to fade. Nay's movements became slower, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. The candle flame flickered lower, threatening to go out. But just before the light disappeared entirely, Nay looked directly at me through the window, her eyes meeting mine with desperate pleading. She needed help, not just acknowledgement or remembrance, but actual assistance with the task that had kept her spirit bound to this place for nearly a century. She was trying to keep her baby alive, and she was failing a little more each year. I spent the next day researching infant care in the 1920s and the specific medical knowledge available to mountain women of that era. What I discovered was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Nay hadn't known enough about newborn care to save her daughter even if she had survived childbirth herself. The baby had died not from starvation alone, but from exposure and improper care. Nay had done everything she thought was right, but she lacked the knowledge and resources that could have made a difference. Her daughter's death wasn't inevitable. It was the result of isolation, poverty, and lack of medical education. For 97 years, Nay had been reliving those 3 days, trying over and over again to save her daughter with the same insufficient knowledge that had failed the first time. She was trapped in a loop of maternal instinct and ignorance, unable to learn from her mistakes because she was already dead. On October 15th, the anniversary of their deaths, I returned to the cemetery with something I hoped might break the cycle. I brought a baby care manual from 1927, the kind of book that might have been available to a young mother if she had lived in a town instead of an isolated mountain cabin. As the candle appeared in the window and Nay began her nightly vigil, I opened the book and began reading aloud. Instructions for proper swaddling, techniques for soothing colicky babies, signs of illness to watch for, methods for keeping infants warm without overheating them. The effect was immediate. Nay stopped her rocking and looked toward the cemetery, listening intently to every word I spoke. As I read, her ghostly form began to change, becoming more solid, more present. She was learning, absorbing information that could have saved her daughter's life if she had possessed it 97 years ago. I read through the night, covering every aspect of infant care that might have made a difference. Feeding schedules, sleep positions, bathing techniques, recognizing signs of distress. With each new piece of information, Nay's care of her daughter became more confident, more effective. As dawn approached, something miraculous happened. The baby stopped crying. For the first time in nearly a century, Nay's daughter was content, properly cared for with knowledge that her mother finally possessed. The infant settled into peaceful sleep in her mother's arms, and Nay smiled with the exhausted satisfaction of a woman who had finally succeeded in keeping her child safe. The candle flame grew brighter one last time, then slowly dimmed as both mother and child faded from view. But this wasn't the desperate fading of previous years. This was the gentle release of souls who had completed their unfinished business. Nay Corbin and her daughter were finally at peace. The Corbin cabin stands dark now on October 15th. Park rangers no longer receive reports of mysterious lights or unexplained phenomena. The anniversary passes quietly, marked only by the changing leaves and the first frost of winter. But sometimes, when I visit other sites where young mothers died in isolation and ignorance, I bring books and knowledge that might have made a difference. Because the dead don't always need prayers or remembrance. Sometimes they need education, the missing information that could have changed everything. Nay taught me that maternal love doesn't end with death, but it can be trapped by ignorance. Her spirit lingered not because she couldn't accept her fate, but because she refused to accept her daughter. Given the right knowledge, even the dead can learn to be better mothers. The candlelit vigil of Corbin Cabin ended when a grieving mother finally received the help she needed to save her child. It took 97 years and the intervention of a stranger, but love found a way to overcome both death and ignorance. Some ghosts haunt places, others haunt problems, returning again and again until someone provides the solution they couldn't find in life. Nay Corbin haunted her own maternal inadequacy, trapped in an endless loop of loving failure. All she needed was someone to teach her how to love more effectively. Every mother deserves that chance, even the dead ones who refuse to give up on their children. Story 4. Scorched monument. The moment my palm touched the scorched stone, I felt my skin begin to burn from the inside out. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was seeing exactly how Margaret Blackwood had died in that house fire 73 years ago, feeling every second of her agony as if it were happening to me right now. I am a monument restoration specialist, and they worked in cemeteries across Virginia for 15 years. I've seen weathered angels, crumbling obelisks, and headstones worn smooth by time. But I never encountered anything like the Blackwood Monument in Tidewater Cemetery until last month. when the Historical Society hired me to assess the damage from what they called repeated lightning strikes. 3 strikes, they said. Once in 1987, again in 2003, and most recently in 2019. Each strike had left its mark on the granite monument, creating what looked like burn patterns that formed the unmistakable outline of a human face twisted in agony. The locals called it a curiosity, a freak of nature. They were wrong. The Blackwood Monument stood 8 feet tall in the oldest section of Tidewater Cemetery, a Victorian-era granite obelisk that had once been pristine white. Now it was streaked with black scorch marks that seemed to pulse and shift in certain light. The face in the stone was horrifying to look at, mouth open in what appeared to be an eternal scream, eyes wide with terror that seemed almost alive. But it was the heat radiating from the monument that made me pause before even touching it. On a cool October morning, the stone was warm enough that I could feel it from 3 feet away. When I held my infrared thermometer to its surface, the reading was impossible. The stone registered 130 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause burns, despite there being no external heat source. My initial assessment was straightforward. Document the damage, research the monument, its history, and recommend preservation methods. Simple work that should have taken a few days at most. I had no idea I was about to uncover a truth that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Margaret Blackwood had died in 1951, according to the inscription at the monument, Space. Beloved wife and mother, taken too soon at age 28. But there were no details about how she died, which struck me as unusual for monuments of that era. Families typically included some reference to the cause of death, especially for someone who died young. I spent my first afternoon in Tidewater, its local library, searching through newspaper archives from 1951. What I found was a single brief article buried on page 4 of the November 15th edition. House fire claims local woman. Margaret Blackwood died when her home on Cedar Street caught fire during the night. Cause of blaze unknown, survived by husband Robert and 2 children. That was it. No investigation details, no witness accounts, nothing about how the fire started or why Margaret couldn't escape. For a small-town newspaper that usually covered church socials and school plays in exhaustive detail, the coverage of Margaret's death was suspiciously sparse. But newspapers weren't the only records available. I drove to Cedar Street that afternoon, looking for the site where Margaret had died. The address from the article led me to a vacant lot overgrown with weeds and bordered by a rusty chain-link fence. According to the county records office, the property had remained empty since 1951. No structure had ever been rebuilt there. Standing in that lot, I felt the same unnatural heat I experienced at the monument. The ground was warm beneath my feet, and when I knelt to touch the earth, my fingers came away with a fine black residue that looked like soot. 73 years after the fire, the land still bore its scars. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The burn patterns in the soil matched the scorch marks on Margaret's monument exactly. The same twisted face, the same expression of agony, seared into the ground where her house had once stood. Whatever had killed Margaret Blackwood was still imprinted on both the place she died and the stone that marked her grave. I returned to the cemetery as evening approached, drawn back to the monument despite every instinct telling me to leave Tidewater and never return. The stone face seemed more defined in the fading light, shadows deepening the lines of terror etched into the granite. But it was what happened at exactly 7:30 that convinced me this wasn't just an unusual geological phenomenon. The monument began to glow, not with reflected light or some trick of the setting sun, but with an internal fire that made the stone itself luminous. The temperature spiked even higher, and I could smell something burning, though there was nothing flammable nearby. The scent was acrid and wrong, like melting plastic mixed with something organic and horrible. That's when I heard the screaming. It came from the monument itself, a sound so filled with agony and terror that it seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. The granite face moved, mouth opening wider, eyes rolling in their sockets as if someone trapped inside the stone was trying desperately to escape. I should have run, should have gotten in my truck and driven straight back to Richmond without looking back. Instead, I did the one thing I had been trained never to do with a damaged monument. I touched it with my bare hand. The vision hit me instantly. I was Margaret Blackwood, lying in bed in a small house on Cedar Street. It was after midnight, and something had woken me from deep sleep. Not a sound, but a smell. Smoke. I sat up and saw orange light flickering under the bedroom door. The house was on fire, But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was that all the doors and windows had been nailed shut from the outside. Someone had trapped me inside a burning house. I felt Margaret's panic as she ran to the window and found boards hammered across the frame. I experienced her growing horror as she realized the bedroom door was locked from the hallway side. I shared her desperate attempts to break through the walls as the fire spread closer, the smoke growing thicker, the heat becoming unbearable. But the worst part of the vision wasn't Margaret's physical suffering. It was the knowledge that someone she trusted had done this to her. Someone who had keys to her house, who knew when she'd be alone, who had planned her death down to the last detail. The vision ended abruptly, leaving me gasping and shaking beside the monument. My palm was red and blistered where I touched the stone, but the burn was nothing compared to what I just experienced. Margaret Blackwood hadn't. She died in an accidental fire. She had been murdered, locked inside her house, and left to burn alive. And her killer had never been caught. I spent the next 2 days researching everything I could find about Margaret's life and death. What I discovered was a pattern of domestic violence that the 1951 investigation had completely ignored. Hospital records showed Margaret had been treated for suspicious injuries multiple times in the months before her death. Broken ribs, bruises, a dislocated shoulder, all explained away as accidents. Robert Blackwood had been questioned about his wife's death but never seriously investigated. He had an alibi, witnesses who placed him at a poker game across town when the fire started. But alibis could be manufactured, and witnesses could be bought or intimidated. The real evidence was in the insurance records. Robert had taken out a life insurance policy on Margaret just 3 months before her death. A substantial policy, worth more money than most families in Tidewater saw in a lifetime. He collected the full amount and left town with his children within weeks of Margaret's funeral. Margaret Blackwood had been murdered for insurance money, and her killer had walked away free. But Margaret hadn't. She accepted that injustice quietly. On my third night in Tidewater, I returned to the cemetery with a digital recorder, hoping to document the sounds I heard from the monument. What I captured was far more disturbing than screaming. It was Margaret's voice, clear and desperate, repeating the same words over and over again. Find him, make him pay. Find him, make him pay. The lightning strikes weren't random acts of nature. They were Margaret's attempts to communicate, to leave a message that someone would eventually understand. The face burned into the stone wasn't just an image of her suffering. It was a demand for justice that had been ignored for over 7 decades. I could have reported my findings to the police, but what evidence did I have? Visions experienced while touching a hot stone? Recordings of voices that could be explained as wind or imagination? The authorities wouldn't believe me, just as they hadn't to believe the signs of domestic violence that should have made Robert Blackwood a suspect in 1951. So I did something that still haunts me. I helped Margaret get her revenge. Using genealogy websites and public records, I tracked down Robert Blackwood's descendants. He died in Florida in 1983, but he had a son, Robert Jr., living in Virginia Beach. A son who worked as a contractor and had access to the tools needed to nail boards over windows and doors. A son who looked exactly like his father and shared his violent tendencies, according to court records showing multiple arrests for domestic assault. I sent Robert Jr. an anonymous letter containing everything I discovered about his father's crime. The insurance documents, the hospital records, the evidence that had been ignored in 1951. Along with the letter, I included a photograph of Margaret's monument and the address of Tidewater Cemetery. 3 days later, Robert Jr. drove to the cemetery. I was waiting in my truck when he arrived, watching as he approached his father's victim's monument with the swagger of a man who never faced consequences for his family's crimes. He read the inscription with obvious disgust, then reached out to touch the scorched stone face, probably intending to vandalize it further. The moment his skin made contact with the granite, Robert Jr. began to scream. But this wasn't the controlled vision I experienced. This was something far more violent and permanent. Robert Jr. convulsed as if he were being electrocuted, his body jerking and spasming while his hand remained stuck to the monument's surface. I could smell burning flesh and see smoke rising from where his palm pressed against the stone. When it finally ended, Robert Jr. collapsed beside the monument, his hand permanently fused to the granite. his body showing the same burn patterns that marked Margaret's final moments. The paramedics said he died of cardiac arrest, but I knew better. Margaret Blackwood had finally gotten her justice. The monument stands different now. The scorched face has softened, no longer twisted in agony but peaceful, almost serene. The stone runs cool to the touch, and the cemetery has returned to its normal quiet dignity. Margaret's spirit has moved on. Her murderer's family line ended, her suffering acknowledged at last. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in other cemeteries, I feel that familiar heat and catch the scent of smoke on windless evenings. Margaret ISN, the only victim seeking justice from beyond the grave. There are others, waiting for someone to touch their monuments and share their stories. The dead don't forget their killers. They just wait for the right person to help them settle the score. Every stone tells a story. Some of those stories demand to be heard, no matter how long it takes or what it costs the living to listen. Margaret taught me that justice delayed ISN, justice denied. Sometimes it's just justice waiting for the right moment to burn. I still do monument restoration, but I'm more careful about what I touch and what stories I'm willing to hear. Because once you help the dead get their revenge, they never really let you go. They know they can count on you to right the wrongs that the living choose to ignore. And there are always more wrongs to be made right. Story 5. President. Its restless spirit, the smell of old paper and ink hit me the moment I stepped onto Jefferson's grave, and I knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. I worked security at Monticello, Virginia's most famous historical site. Been walking these grounds for 12 years, protecting Thomas Jefferson's home from vandals and curious tourists who get too close to priceless artifacts. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 weeks ago, and I swear on my mother's grave that every word is true. It started with the overnight shift from hell. My partner Jake called in sick, leaving me alone to patrol 43 acres of mountain estate until sunrise. The house tour ended at 6 p.m. The last visitors drove away by 7, and by 8 o'clock I was completely alone with the ghost of America's third president. The family graveyard sits about 200 yards southeast of the main house, surrounded by a black iron fence that is supposed to keep people out. Jefferson's obelisk tombstone rises 12 feet into the air, casting long shadows across the other family plots when the moon is right. During the day, it is peaceful. At night, something else entirely takes over. My first patrol around 9:30 seemed normal enough. I checked all the gates, tested door locks on the visitor center, and made my way through the gardens toward the cemetery. The October air was crisp, carrying the smell of dying leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys in Charlottesville. Everything exactly as it should be. But as I approached Jefferson's tomb, the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees in the span of 10 steps. My breath started coming out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the iron fence despite the mild weather. The hair on my arms stood straight up, and every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around and walk away. That is when I smelled it. Paper and ink, like walking into an old library or archive. But this wasn't the pleasant smell of aged books. This was something sharper, more acidic, with an underlying metallic tang that made my eyes water. It seemed to be rising directly from Jefferson's grave, growing stronger as I got closer. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the graveyard. Everything looked normal at first glance. The obelisk stood exactly where it had for nearly 2 centuries, the smaller headstones of family members arranged in neat rows around it. But something was off about the shadows. They seemed too dark, too deep, as if they were holes cut into reality itself. Then I saw the writing. Words were appearing on Jefferson's tombstone, carved into the marble by invisible hands. Not the familiar inscription about his founding of the University of Virginia and authoring the Declaration of Independence. This was something else entirely, scratched in desperate, jagged letters that seemed to glow with their own pale light. I cannot rest. The work remains unfinished. They must know the truth. The words faded as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only smooth marble and my racing heart. I blinked hard, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. But the smell of paper and ink grew stronger, and the temperature continued to drop until I could see ice crystals forming on the nearby trees. That is when I felt the presence watching me. It started as a prickling sensation between my shoulder blades, the unmistakable feeling of being observed by hostile eyes. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but found only empty shadows and silent headstones. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger by the second. I backed away from Jefferson, this grave, but the presence followed. Invisible footsteps crunched through fallen leaves behind me, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I sped up, they sped up. Something was stalking me through the graveyard of America, its most celebrated founding father. The smart thing would have been to call for backup or retreat to the visitor center until sunrise. Instead, I found myself drawn back toward the obelisk, compelled by a force I couldn't understand or resist. The smell of paper and ink was overwhelming now, so thick I could taste it coating my tongue and throat. As I approached the tomb again, new words began appearing on the marble surface. This time they came faster, carved by frantic, invisible hands that left tiny fragments of stone scattered at the base of the monument. The letters, hidden, must be found. Democracy dies in darkness. The temperature plummeted further, and my breath began forming actual clouds of vapor in the suddenly arctic air. Frost spread across the ground in intricate patterns, and the iron fence started creaking and groaning as metal contracted in the unnatural cold. That is when I saw him. Thomas Jefferson materialized slowly, like smoke condensing into human form. He stood beside his own grave, tall and gaunt, dressed in the colonial clothing he had worn in life. But this wasn't the dignified statesman from history books. This was something far more disturbing. His face was twisted with anguish, eyes burning with an intensity that made me take an involuntary step backward. His hands were stained with what looked like ink, dark streaks running up his arms like he had been writing frantically for hours. Most terrifying of all, his mouth moved constantly, as if he were speaking urgent words that made no sound. Jefferson raised one ink-stained hand and pointed directly at me. The smell of paper and ink became suffocating, and I felt an overwhelming pressure in my head, as if someone were trying to force information directly into my brain. Images flashed through my mind. Hidden compartments, secret documents, letters that could change everything we thought we knew about American history. He was trying to tell me something important enough to keep his spirit trapped at Monticello for over 2 centuries, unable to rest until his message was delivered. But the psychic pressure was too intense. I stumbled backward, flashlight falling from numb fingers as the ghostly president advanced toward me. His mouth opened wider, and even though no sound emerged, I could feel his desperation, his urgent need to communicate secrets that had died with him. I ran, sprinted through the graveyard, vaulted the fence, and didn't stop until I reached the visitor center. Behind me, the temperature began returning to normal, and the smell of paper and ink gradually faded. But the image of Jefferson, his anguished face, remained burned into my memory. The rest of my shift passed without incident, but I couldn't shake what I had experienced. The next morning, I started researching everything I could find about Jefferson, his death and burial. What I discovered made my blood run cold. According to historical records, Jefferson spent his final weeks writing furiously, working on correspondence and documents that he claimed were of vital importance to the future of the Republic. Many of these writings disappeared after his death, allegedly destroyed by family members who felt they were too controversial for public consumption. But what if they weren't destroyed? What if they were hidden somewhere at Monticello, waiting for someone to discover them? Jefferson had designed the house himself, with all kinds of secret passages and concealed compartments. He was paranoid about privacy, constantly worried about political enemies gaining access to his private thoughts. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that Jefferson, his spirit, was trying to guide someone to these lost documents. Something he considered so important that he couldn't rest until it was brought to light. But what could be earth-shattering enough to trap the soul of a founding father? I started investigating the house more thoroughly during my shifts, looking for hidden compartments or concealed spaces that might contain Jefferson's missing writings. I found several secret hiding places that tourists never see, but all of them were empty. Whatever Jefferson was trying to show me remained elusive. The ghostly encounters continued night after night. Always the same pattern: the dropping temperature, the smell of paper and ink, the desperate appearance of Jefferson, his spirit trying to communicate something vital. Sometimes he would point toward the house, other times toward different sections of the graveyard. But I could never decipher exactly what he was trying to tell me. 3 weeks into this supernatural torment, I made a breakthrough. While researching Jefferson, his architectural plans, I discovered references to a hidden room beneath the main house that had never been found by modern historians. According to the original blueprints, it was accessed through a concealed panel in the wine cellar. That night, I broke protocol and entered the house during my shift. Using Jefferson, his own architectural drawings as a guide, I located the wine cellar and began searching for the hidden panel. It took me over an hour, but I finally found a section of wall that sounded hollow when tapped. The panel slid aside to reveal a narrow staircase leading deeper underground. My flashlight illuminated a small chamber that had been sealed for over 2 centuries. The air that rushed out smelled exactly like the phantom odor that had been haunting me. Paper and ink, but concentrated 1,000 times over. Inside the hidden room, I found them. Dozens of documents in Jefferson, this distinctive handwriting, preserved by the dry underground conditions. Letters, essays, and detailed notes that he had apparently hidden away before his death. As I read through them by flashlight, I understood why his spirit had been so desperate to communicate. These weren't just historical curiosities. They contained Jefferson, his true thoughts about slavery, democracy, and the future of America. Thoughts that contradicted much of what we learned in school. Letters detailing secret agreements with foreign powers. Evidence of corruption among other founding fathers. Plans for reforms that could have prevented the Civil War if they had been implemented. But most shocking of all were the warnings. Jefferson had foreseen many of the problems that would plague American democracy in the centuries to come. Political parties becoming more important than principles. Wealthy interests corrupting the electoral process. The danger of leaders who valued personal power over public service. He had written detailed solutions to these problems, constitutional amendments and reforms that might have prevented much of the political chaos we see today. But these documents had been hidden away after his death, deemed too dangerous or controversial for public consumption. Now I understood why Jefferson, his spirit couldn't rest. He had seen the future of American democracy, and he had tried to provide the tools to save it. But his most important work had been buried with him, literally and figuratively. I carefully photographed every document before sealing the chamber again. The next morning, I turned the evidence over to historians at the University of Virginia. Jefferson, his own institution. They were still analyzing the writings, trying to determine how much should be made public and how much might be too destabilizing for modern politics. But I haven't seen Jefferson, his ghost, since that night. The graveyard at Monticello is peaceful again, free from supernatural cold spots and the smell of phantom ink. His spirit finally found the rest that had eluded him for 2 centuries. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. Jefferson, his hidden warnings about American democracy are more relevant now than ever, but they reburied in academic committees and scholarly debates. Maybe his ghost will return if those documents never see the light of day. Or maybe some truths are too dangerous for any democracy to survive. Maybe Jefferson, his spirit, understood that some secrets should stay buried, even if it means eternal restlessness for those who carry them. All I know is that Thomas Jefferson had something urgent to tell us, something important enough to trap his soul at Monticello for over 200 years. Whether we're ready to hear his message is another question entirely. Quick breath, quick glance over your shoulder, subscribe and hit that bell before we move on. And tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Story 6. Poison ground. The chemical burns on my hands are finally starting to heal, but I can still taste the metallic poison in my mouth 3 weeks after I escaped from Appalachian Cemetery. And I know those things are still hunting for me. My name is Chris, and I am an environmental cleanup consultant. I specialize in assessing contaminated sites, usually old industrial locations where decades of chemical dumping have left the soil toxic and dangerous. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well, and after 15 years in the business, I thought I'd seen every possible combination of human stupidity and environmental destruction. I was wrong. Last month, I received a contract from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection to assess contamination levels at Appalachian Cemetery in an abandoned mining town called Sulphur Creek. The town had died in the 1980s when the coal company pulled out, leaving behind a legacy of poisoned groundwater and contaminated soil that made the area uninhabitable. The cemetery was built on a hillside overlooking where the town used to be, and according to satellite imagery, it showed clear signs of environmental damage. The vegetation was dead or dying, the soil appeared discolored, and chemical runoff from the old mining operations had apparently seeped into the burial ground over several decades. My job was straightforward: document the contamination levels, assess the risk to public health, and recommend cleanup procedures. The state wanted to determine if the cemetery could be safely relocated or if it needed to be permanently sealed off from human access. The drive to Sulphur Creek took me through some of the most devastated landscape I'd ever seen. Miles of dead forest, poisoned streams running orange with acid mine drainage, and abandoned buildings slowly collapsing under the weight of their own toxic legacy. The mountains here weren't the lush green peaks you see in tourism brochures. They were gray, scarred, stripped bare by decades of coal extraction. Blackridge Cemetery sat at the end of a dirt road that wound up through dead timber and exposed rock faces. When I finally reached the burial ground, I understood why the state was concerned about public safety. The cemetery was a biological dead zone. Nothing grew there except scattered patches of sickly yellow grass that looked more like chemical residue than living vegetation. The headstones were stained with mineral deposits from acidic groundwater, and many of them were slowly dissolving from prolonged exposure to contaminated runoff. But what struck me most was the smell. Even with my respirator and protective gear, I could detect the sharp, metallic odor of heavy metal contamination mixed with something organic and rotten that seemed to rise from the earth itself. I set up my testing equipment and began taking soil samples from various locations throughout the cemetery. The readings were immediately alarming. Lead levels 50 times higher than safe limits. Mercury concentrations that should have been impossible in a natural environment. And arsenic readings so high that exposure for more than a few minutes could cause severe poisoning. But the most disturbing discovery came when I tested the air quality near the graves themselves. My instruments detected gaseous emissions rising from multiple burial sites, chemical vapors that had no business existing in a cemetery environment. The gases were a complex mixture of industrial solvents, heavy metals in particulate form, and organic compounds that suggested some kind of ongoing chemical reaction beneath the surface. As I worked, I began experiencing symptoms that my training had taught me to recognize as early signs of toxic exposure. Headaches that felt like ice picks behind my eyes. Nausea that came in waves, forcing me to remove my respirator to vomit onto the poisoned ground. And a metallic taste in my mouth that grew stronger the longer I stayed in the cemetery. But I pushed through the discomfort because the data I was collecting didn't make scientific sense. The contamination patterns were too concentrated, too localized around specific graves. Chemical runoff from mining operations should spread more evenly across the landscape, not cluster in distinct hotspots that seemed to correspond with individual burial sites. That's when I started paying attention to the dates on the headstones. Most of the burials dated from the 1950s through the 1980s, the peak years of mining activity in Sulphur Creek. But what caught my attention was how many of the death dates clustered around specific years when major industrial accidents had occurred in the area. 1967, a chemical spill at the processing plant that killed 12 workers and contaminated the local water supply. 1974, an underground explosion that trapped 37 miners, most of whom died from toxic gas exposure rather than the blast itself. 1981, a tailings dam failure that flooded the valley with millions of gallons of contaminated slurry, poisoning everything downstream. The cemetery wasn't just contaminated by runoff from the mining operations. It was where they buried the victims of those industrial disasters, people whose bodies had been saturated with toxic chemicals before they died, turning each grave into a concentrated source of ongoing contamination. But even that realization didn't prepare me for what happened next. As I was collecting samples near a cluster of graves from 1974, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. At first, I assumed it was heat shimmer rising from the poisoned ground, but the air temperature was too cool for that kind of atmospheric distortion. The movement was coming from the graves themselves. Wisps of yellowish gas were seeping up through cracks in the earth, forming column-like shapes that almost resembled human figures. The vapors moved against the wind, flowing in patterns that seemed purposeful, deliberate, as if they were being directed by some kind of intelligence. I checked my gas detection equipment, expecting to find readings that would explain what I was seeing in terms of normal chemical processes. Instead, my instruments went haywire, displaying error messages and impossible readings that suggested concentrations of toxic materials that should have killed me instantly. The gaseous figures began moving toward me. They didn't walk or float like traditional ghosts in horror movies. They flowed like liquid mercury, maintaining roughly human shapes while constantly shifting and reforming. As they got closer, The symptoms I'd been experiencing intensified dramatically. The headache became excruciating. The nausea turned into violent retching, and the metallic taste in my mouth became so strong I could barely breathe. But worse than the physical effects was the psychological impact. Looking at those toxic figures, I felt a crushing sense of rage and despair that wasn't my own. These weren't just random chemical emissions. They were the concentrated fury of people who had died from preventable poisoning, workers who had been sacrificed for corporate profits and buried in ground that continued to leach poison into their remains. I tried to retreat to my vehicle, but the figures surrounded me, cutting off every escape route. They moved with coordination that suggested shared intelligence, herding me toward the center of the cemetery where the contamination readings had been highest. That is when I saw the source of the poisoning. Hidden beneath decades of dead vegetation was a series of unmarked concrete structures, industrial waste storage that had been illegally dumped in the cemetery sometime in the 1980s. The mining company hadn't just abandoned their operations when they left Sulphur Creek. They used the burial ground as their final disposal site for the most toxic materials they couldn't safely store anywhere else. The gaseous figures weren't just the spirits of poisoned workers. They were the physical manifestation of industrial waste that had been mixed with human remains, creating something that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. As I stood there surrounded by these toxic entities, I finally understood what had happened in Sulphur Creek. The mining company had known their operations were poisoning the workers and the environment. When people started dying from exposure, they buried them in the cemetery along with barrels of concentrated chemical waste, ensuring that the evidence of their crimes would literally be buried with their victims. But toxic materials don't stay buried forever. Over decades, the barrels had corroded and leaked, mixing industrial poison with decomposing human remains to create something unprecedented in environmental science. Chemically animated organic matter that retained the memories and emotions of the people it had once been. The figures pressed closer, and I felt their rage burning through my protective equipment like acid. They wanted justice, wanted the world to know what had been done to them, wanted someone to bear witness to the corporate murder that had been covered up for decades. But they were also dying to touch me, to share their poisoning with someone who could carry their story beyond the boundaries of the contaminated cemetery. I ran, my training kicked in, and I moved through the burial ground as quickly as my protective gear would allow, dodging between headstones and avoiding the worst concentrations of toxic gas. The figures pursued me, their forms becoming more solid and aggressive as they absorbed more chemical emissions from the poisoned ground. I reached my truck just as the first gaseous entity touched my exposed skin above the wrist seal of my hazmat glove. The contact burned like acid, leaving chemical burns that ate through flesh down to the bone. But more than physical damage, the touch transferred something else. Memories that didn't. They belonged to me. Images of workers dying slowly from industrial poisoning while company executives covered up the evidence. I drove away from Blackridge Cemetery faster than was safe on those mountain roads, but I could feel the toxic entities following me in ways that had nothing to do with physical pursuit. The contamination had gotten into my system. Not just the chemicals, but the rage and desperation of the poisoned dead. For 3 weeks, I've been fighting to cleanse the poison from my body and my mind. Medical tests showed dangerous levels of heavy metals in my blood, chemical contamination that should have killed me. But worse than the physical effects are the memories that aren't mine, the knowledge of what really happened in Sulphur Creek that I can forget or ignore. I submitted my report to the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, documenting everything I found in terms of contamination levels and public health risks. But I left out the supernatural elements, the gaseous figures, and the chemical animated remains. No one would believe such a story, and they wouldn't help the victims get the justice they deserve. Instead, they've been quietly contacting investigative journalists and environmental lawyers, providing them with evidence of the illegal waste disposal and corporate cover-up. The contamination at Blackridge Cemetery is so severe that it can be hidden much longer. And when the full scope of the environmental crime is revealed, there will be consequences for the company that thought they could bury their sins along with their victims. But I know the toxic entities in that cemetery want to rest until their story is fully told. They're still there, still seeping up through the poisoned ground, still waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to document their existence. The chemical burns on my hands are healing, but the contamination in my blood may never fully clear. I carry part of Sulphur Creek with me now, part of the poison and part of the rage of people who died from preventable industrial murder. Sometimes, late at night, I can taste the metallic flavor of that contaminated cemetery, and I know the gaseous figures are calling to me, wanting me to return and complete the work they started. They want their story told completely, honestly, without the sanitized language of environmental reports and government bureaucracy. They want the world to know that some places are poisoned not just by chemicals, but by the accumulated evil of corporations that value profit over human life. They want people to understand that environmental contamination isn't just about soil and water quality, but about the spiritual poison that seeps into a place when innocent people are sacrificed for money and power. Blackridge Cemetery will eventually be cleaned up or sealed off, the immediate environmental threat contained through conventional methods. But the deeper contamination, the spiritual poison that animates the toxic dead, can be removed with standard remediation techniques. That kind of pollution requires a different kind of cleanup, the kind that comes only when the truth is fully exposed and justice is finally served. Until then, the gaseous figures will continue rising from the poisoned ground, waiting for the next person who can help them tell their story to a world that desperately needs to hear it. The dead dawn to rest peacefully when they've been murdered, and they rest even less peacefully when they've been poisoned by the greed of people who thought they could get away with mass murder by calling it industrial accident. Some contamination goes deeper than soil and water. Some poison seeps into the very soul of a place, and no amount of environmental cleanup can wash away the stain of corporate evil. The entities at Blackridge Cemetery understand this truth better than anyone. And now, so do I. Story 7. Thing in the sinking creek mists. The trail camera footage showed something impossible moving through the fog at 3:17 a.m. And I knew I had to delete it before anyone else could see what I'd captured in Sarver Hollow. My name is Jake, and I've been a wildlife photographer for 15 years. I specialize in documenting rare Appalachian species, the kind of work that takes you deep into forgotten valleys where cell phones don't work and the nearest road might be 20 miles behind you. I thought I'd seen everything these ancient mountains could throw at me. I was dead wrong. 3 months ago, I received a commission from Virginia Wildlife magazine to investigate reports of unusual animal activity near Sinking Creek Cemetery in Sarver Hollow. Local hunters claimed something was disturbing their hunting patterns, scaring off game in ways they never experienced. Deer weren't just spooked, they were fleeing the entire valley, leaving behind feeding areas they used for generations. The locals wouldn't talk much about it, but the few details I gathered painted a disturbing picture. Hikers reported feeling watched by something massive but invisible. Trail runners found themselves inexplicably lost in areas they'd known their entire lives. And everyone mentioned the same thing, a feeling that the mountain itself had turned hostile, predatory. Sarver Hollow sits deep in the Appalachian wilderness, accessible only by a winding dirt road that ends at a small parking area near the old cemetery. The graveyard dates back to the 1800s, serving the scattered families who once eked out hardscrabble lives in these remote valleys. Most of the headstones are weathered beyond reading, and thick forest has reclaimed much of the burial ground. The locals have their own legends about the place, of course. They talk about George, a benevolent ghost who supposedly protects lost hikers and guides them back to safety. But underneath those comfortable ghost stories, I sense something darker, older fears that people didn't want to discuss with an outsider. I set up my base camp about a quarter mile from the cemetery, in a small clearing beside Sinking Creek. The water runs clear and cold here, fed by mountain springs and seasonal runoff. But what struck me immediately was how quiet the area was. No bird songs, no insect noise, none of the usual forest sounds that should fill these mountains day and night. I installed 6 trail cameras in a wide circle around the cemetery and along the major game trails. These weren't cheap tourist cameras, but professional wildlife monitoring equipment with infrared capability and motion sensors sensitive enough to detect a mouse at 50 yards. If something was scaring off the local wildlife, I was going to document it. The first week yielded nothing unusual. A few deer passing through, some raccoons, the normal nighttime traffic you'd expect in a healthy forest ecosystem. But I noticed the animals all moved differently here, faster and more nervous than usual. They kept looking over their shoulders, ears constantly twitching, as if expecting pursuit. On the 8th night, everything changed. I was reviewing footage from the previous evening when I found the first anomaly. Camera 3, positioned overlooking the cemetery's eastern edge, had recorded something at 11:43 p.m. that made no sense. The infrared showed a large mass moving between the headstones, but the shape was all wrong. It wasn't solid like an animal or person, but flowing, shifting, like liquid mercury in constant motion. The timestamp showed the mass present for exactly 17 minutes before it simply vanished. Not moved off-screen, not faded gradually, but disappeared between one frame and the next as if it had never been there at all. I assumed equipment malfunction and made a note to check that camera the next day. But when I reviewed the other cameras, I found similar anomalies. Each one had recorded brief appearances of shapeless, moving forms that defied explanation. The motion sensors had triggered, but the images showed nothing that should exist in the natural world. Camera 4 captured the most disturbing footage. At 2:15 a.m., it recorded what appeared to be a massive shadow moving uphill through the trees, but there was nothing casting the shadow. The darkness moved independently, flowing like thick fog but maintaining a roughly triangular shape that suggested something alive and purposeful. That night, I decided to conduct a personal surveillance of the cemetery. I positioned myself on a rocky outcrop about 200 yards away, equipped with night vision equipment and infrared binoculars. The October air was crisp and still, perfect conditions for observation. At 10:30 p.m., the temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than 5 minutes. My breath began fogging immediately, and frost started forming on the metal parts of my equipment. But the weather forecast had called for a clear, mild night with temperatures in the 50s. This sudden cold snap made no meteorological sense. Then I heard the breathing. It was subtle at first, like wind through the trees, but there was no wind. The sound came from below, from the direction of the cemetery, a slow, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation that seemed to come from something enormous. Each breath lasted about 30 seconds, with long pauses between, as if whatever was breathing didn't, to follow normal biological patterns. Through my night vision scope, I watched the cemetery carefully. The headstones stood silent and still, but the ground itself seemed to be moving slightly, rising and falling in rhythm with the breathing sounds. It was as if something massive was lying beneath the entire graveyard, something so large that its breathing could affect the earth above it. At midnight, the mist began rising from Sinking Creek. This wasn't normal fog formation. The mist rose in distinct columns, like smoke from carefully placed fires, but there were no heat sources to create such an effect. As I watched, the columns began moving toward the cemetery, flowing uphill against the natural air currents. The mist reached the burial ground and began coalescing into something that challenged everything I knew about physics and biology. The separate columns merged into a single, massive form that towered above the tallest trees. It had no fixed shape, constantly shifting between different configurations, but there was definitely intelligence behind its movements. The thing noticed me watching. I felt its attention like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Through my night vision equipment, I could see what might have been eyes, darker spots within the shifting mass that oriented directly toward my position. The breathing sound stopped, replaced by something worse. Complete, absolute silence that seemed to muffle even the sound of my own heartbeat. The creature began moving in my direction. It didn't walk or crawl, but flowed like liquid across the terrain, covering ground at an impossible speed. Trees didn't stop it or slow it down. The thing simply passed through them as if they weren't there, leaving behind a trail of withered vegetation and frost-covered earth. I ran. My years of wilderness experience kicked in, and I moved through the forest as quietly and quickly as possible, using deer paths and natural cover to mask my retreat. But I could feel the thing following me, not making sound but somehow disturbing the very air around it. The temperature continued dropping wherever it went, and I could track its progress by the spreading zone of unnatural cold. I reached my truck and drove out of Sarver Hollow faster than was safe on those winding mountain roads. I didn't stop until I reached the interstate, didn't feel safe until I was surrounded by traffic and streetlights and all the comforting signs of human civilization. But the story doesn't end there. When I returned 3 days later to retrieve my equipment, I found something that shook me to my core. All 6 trail cameras were still in position, still functioning, but their memory cards contained impossible footage. Each camera had recorded the same event from different angles, the massive entity moving through the forest, but not as separate incidents over multiple nights. The timestamps showed everything happening simultaneously, as if the creature existed in multiple locations at once. or as if it was so large that my cameras were recording different parts of the same enormous being. But the most terrifying revelation came when I analyzed the creature's movement patterns. It hadn't been randomly wandering through the forest. It had been systematically checking each camera location, examining my equipment with what appeared to be intelligent curiosity. The footage showed dark tendrils of mist reaching out to touch each camera, and in those moments of contact, I could see something resembling thought patterns in the way the creature moved. It was learning about me, gathering information about the person who had been watching it. The final piece of footage was the most disturbing. Camera 6, positioned along the access road, had recorded me arriving and setting up my surveillance position 3 days earlier. But in the infrared footage, I wasn't alone. The massive entity was already there, following just behind me, close enough to touch but somehow invisible to my normal senses. The creature had been stalking me from the moment I entered Sarver Hollow. I spent weeks researching the history of the area, looking for any explanation for what I encountered. What I found in old county records and family histories painted a picture of something ancient and territorial that had always lived in these mountains. The Cherokee had stories about places where the earth itself was alive and hostile to human presence. Early settlers reported entire families disappearing in certain valleys, leaving behind homesteads that were found abandoned but undamaged, as if the occupants had simply walked away from their lives without taking anything with them. The modern cemetery was built on the site of much older burial grounds, places where indigenous peoples had interred their dead for thousands of years. Some of the settler accounts mentioned disturbing existing graves to make room for their own, ignoring warnings from the few remaining Cherokee about the consequences of such desecration. I began to understand that what I encountered wasn't just a creature living in Sarver Hollow. It was Sarver Hollow, or at least something so connected to that specific place that the distinction didn't matter. The entity was the accumulated spiritual presence of everyone who had ever been buried there, grown into something vast and alien over centuries of undisturbed existence. The locals' stories about George, the helpful ghost, were entirely wrong. The entity did guide lost hikers, but not to safety. It guided them away from its territory, using just enough benevolent intervention to maintain its preferred isolation. People who listened to George and followed his guidance made it home safely. Those who ignored the warnings and ventured deeper into the hollow simply disappeared. I realized I had been tested during my encounter. The creature had the power to make me disappear like all the others, but it had chosen to let me leave. Perhaps because I had shown proper respect by retreating when confronted, or perhaps because it recognized that I posed no real threat to its domain. But there was another possibility that kept me awake at night. Maybe it had let me go because it wanted its story told. Maybe after centuries of hiding in the mists of Sarver Hollow, the entity was ready for the outside world to know it existed. I submitted my report to Virginia Wildlife magazine, but I edited out the supernatural elements and focused on the unusual wildlife patterns. I described the area as ecologically sensitive and recommended against increased human traffic. The magazine published a brief article discouraging hiking in Sarver Hollow due to unstable terrain and unpredictable weather patterns. But I kept the original footage, all of it, stored on encrypted drives that I hidden in 3 different locations. Because I know the truth about what lives in those mountains, and I know it is still there, still watching, still waiting. The entity in Sarver Hollow isn't evil in any human sense. It is simply ancient, territorial, and completely alien to our understanding of life and death. It protects what it considers its own, and after centuries of human encroachment on indigenous lands, it has claimed one small valley where the old ways still hold power. I haven't returned to Sarver Hollow, and I never will. But sometimes, on foggy nights when the temperature drops unexpectedly, I find myself looking over my shoulder, remembering the feeling of being stalked by something older than human civilization. The mountains of Appalachia hold secrets that most people never encounter, forces that predate European settlement and indigenous memory alike. Most of these ancient powers are content to remain hidden, to coexist peacefully with the modern world as long as their territories are respected. But some are beginning to stir, responding to climate change and human development in ways we don't yet understand. The entity in Sarver Hollow might be just the beginning, the first of many ancient guardians deciding that passive hiding is no longer enough. If you ever find yourself hiking in the remote valleys of Appalachia, pay attention to the warning signs. When the forest goes silent, when the temperature drops without reason, When you feel eyes watching you from shadows that shouldn't to exist, trust your instincts. Turn around, walk away, to look back. Some places were never meant for human footsteps, and some things are better left undisturbed in the mist. Story 8. Reflector. This gate, the reflection in the gate showed me at 90 years old, standing in a cemetery I'd never seen before, and I knew I was looking at the day I would die. My name is Mark, and I am a genealogy researcher. I trace family histories for people who want to connect with their roots, usually wealthy clients trying to prove they descended from someone important. It is honest work that takes me to small towns and forgotten cemeteries across Appalachia, places where the past feels more real than the present. 3 weeks ago, I received an unusual request from a client named Patricia Caldwell. She wanted me to find the burial location of her great-great-grandmother, Abigail Morse, who had died in West Virginia in 1887. Patricia had no family records, no death certificate, nothing but a name and a rough time frame. She offered to pay double my usual fee, which should have been my first warning sign. The research led me to a tiny community called Stillwater Hollow, population maybe 200 people scattered across several mountain ridges. The town consisted of a post office, a general store, and a church that doubled as the community center. When I asked about old cemeteries, the locals got quiet, exchanging looks that suggested they knew something they didn't want to share with an outsider. Finally, the postmaster, an elderly man named Ezra, gave me directions to what he called the Hollow Ground Cemetery. He warned me to be respectful, to leave before sunset, and most importantly, to not look back at the gate when I left. I assumed this was just mountain superstition, the kind of colorful local folklore that makes good stories but has no basis in reality. The cemetery sat at the end of a dirt road that wound through dense forest for nearly 3 miles. My GPS lost signal halfway there, but the path was clear enough to follow. When I finally reached the clearing, I understood why the locals had been reluctant to discuss the place. Hollow Ground Cemetery felt wrong from the moment I stepped out of my car. The burial ground was small, maybe 50 graves total, but it was immaculately maintained despite being miles from the nearest house. The grass was perfectly trimmed, the headstones were clean, and fresh flowers decorated several graves. Someone was clearly caring for this place, but I saw no evidence of who that might be. What dominated the cemetery, though, was the gate. It stood at the far end of the burial ground, framing what had once been the main entrance before the access road was rerouted. The gate was wrought iron, ornate and beautiful, but what made it striking was the central panel. Instead of decorative metalwork, it held a polished surface that reflected like a perfect mirror. The metal gleamed so brightly it was almost painful to look at directly. I spent 4 hours documenting every headstone in the cemetery, photographing inscriptions and taking GPS coordinates. Abigail Morse wasn't there, but I did find several graves from the 1880s that might provide clues to her actual burial location. The work was routine, professional, exactly what I'd done hundreds of times before in similar cemeteries. But I kept glancing at that mirror gate, and every time I did, something felt off about my reflection. At first, I attributed it to the angle of the sun or the quality of the polished metal. Antique mirrors often distort images in subtle ways, but as the afternoon progressed, I became increasingly uncomfortable with what I was seeing in that reflective surface. My reflection looked older than it should, not dramatically so, but enough to be noticeable. The lines around my eyes seemed deeper, my hair appeared grayer, and there was something in my expression that I didn't recognize. It was the face of a man who had seen things that changed him, aged him in ways that went beyond simple time. When I finished my work around 5 in the evening, I packed my equipment and headed back to my car. The gate stood between me and the exit, so I had to pass directly in front of it to leave the cemetery. As I approached, I remembered Ezra's warning about not looking back, but I'd never been superstitious about such things. I glanced at my reflection one more time as I passed through the gateway. What I saw in that polished metal made me stumble and nearly drop my camera bag. The reflection showed me as an old man, maybe 90 years old, with white hair and deeply lined skin. But I wasn't standing in Hollow Ground Cemetery anymore. The background showed a different burial ground, one with newer headstones and different landscaping. And I wasn't alone in the reflection. Behind my elderly image stood a woman in an old-fashioned black dress, her face pale and serious. She was gesturing for me to follow her, pointing towards something outside the mirror's view. When I turned to look over my shoulder, there was no one there. But when I looked back at the gate, both figures were gone, and my reflection had returned to normal. I drove back to town with my hands shaking and my mind racing. The logical part of my brain insisted I experienced some kind of optical illusion, maybe caused by fatigue or the stress of working alone in an isolated location. But the image of that elderly version of myself, standing in an unknown cemetery with a mysterious woman, felt more real than any hallucination should. At the motel that night, I researched the history of Hollow Ground Cemetery online. What I found made me wish I did listen to Ezra's warnings more carefully. The cemetery had been established in 1823, but the mirror gate wasn't installed until 1887, the same year Abigail Morse had died. According to local newspaper archives, the gate was commissioned by a wealthy widow named Constance Whitmore, who claimed she wanted to create a memorial that would allow the living to connect with the dead. But the gate's history was troubled from the beginning. Within months of its installation, visitors reported disturbing experiences. Some saw themselves aged beyond recognition. Others glimpsed deceased relatives standing behind them in the reflection. A few claimed to see their own deaths played out in the polished surface like some kind of prophetic vision. By 1890, the local church had officially condemned the gate and tried to have it removed. But every attempt to dismantle it had ended in tragedy. Workers would be found dead at the cemetery with no obvious cause, their bodies unmarked but their faces locked in expressions of absolute terror. The gate remained, and people learned to avoid it. But the most disturbing detail came from a 1923 newspaper article about a missing persons case. A genealogy researcher named Thomas Fletcher had vanished while investigating family histories in the area. His car was found parked at Hollow Ground Cemetery, his equipment scattered around the burial ground, but he was never seen again. The article included a photograph of Thomas Fletcher. He looked exactly like the elderly version of myself I'd seen in the gate, its reflection. I spent the next day trying to convince myself this was all coincidence. Thomas Fletcher might have been a distant relative, someone who shared enough genetic traits to create a family resemblance. The reflection had been a trick of light and shadow, nothing more. I was letting local superstitions affect my judgment. But that night, I dreamed about the woman in the black dress. She stood in a cemetery I'd never seen, surrounded by modern headstones and carefully maintained landscaping. In the dream, she spoke my name and gestured for me to follow her deeper into the burial ground. When I tried to speak, to ask who she was and what she wanted, no sound came from my throat. I woke up with the absolute certainty that I'd seen that cemetery before, not in real life, but in the gate, this reflection. It was the place where my elderly self had been standing, the burial ground where I would apparently die decades from now. The rational thing would have been to leave Stillwater Hollow, report my failure to find Abigail Morse's grave, and never return. But I couldn't, to shake the feeling that this case was connected to something larger, something that had been drawing genealogy researchers to this place for over a century. I went back to Hollow Ground Cemetery the next morning. This time, I approached the mirror gate deliberately, methodically, like a scientist conducting an experiment. I stood at different angles, observed my reflection under varying light conditions, and took detailed photographs of everything I saw. The results were consistent and terrifying. Every time I looked into the polished surface, I saw myself at different ages, in different locations, always standing in cemeteries I didn't recognize. Sometimes I appeared as a young man in burial grounds that looked historical, antique. Other times I saw myself as middle-aged or elderly, in modern cemeteries with recent grave markers. But in every reflection, the woman in the black dress was there, always pointing, always trying to guide me towards something just outside the mirror's view. On my third day of investigation, I finally understood what she was trying to show me. I was looking at my reflections from a new angle when I noticed something I'd missed before. In the background of one image, behind my middle-aged self, I could see a headstone with a name carved into it. The letters were partially obscured, but I could make out enough to recognize it, Abigail Morse. The gate wasn't just showing me random visions of the future. It was showing me the path I needed to follow to complete my research. Each reflection represented a cemetery I would visit, a piece of the puzzle that would eventually lead me to Patricia Caldwell, this great-great-grandmother. But the final reflection, the one showing me as a 90-year-old man, suggested that this search would consume the rest of my life. I would spend decades moving from cemetery to cemetery, following the guidance of the woman in the black dress, until I finally found what I was looking for in that last, unknown burial ground. That was when I realized who the woman was. Abigail Morse hadn't been buried in Hollow Ground Cemetery, but her spirit was connected to it somehow. She was the one guiding genealogy researchers to this place, using the mirror gate to show them the path they needed to follow to find her final resting place. But there was a cost to accepting her guidance. Everyone who followed her path became trapped in it, spending their entire lives moving from cemetery to cemetery, aging and dying in the service of someone else, this unfinished business. Thomas Fletcher hadn't. He disappeared in 1923. He seen the same reflections I was seeing, accepted the same guidance, and spent the rest of his life following Abigail Morse's trail. His death in 1963, at the age of 90, had been recorded in a cemetery registry 3 states away, listed simply as an unknown elderly man found dead among the headstones. I was being offered the same choice. I could leave now, report my failure to Patricia Caldwell, and return to my normal life. Or I could accept the guidance of the mirror gate, follow the path laid out in those reflections, and spend the next 40 years of my life in the service of the dead. Looking into that polished surface one more time, I saw my elderly self again, standing in that final cemetery with Abigail Morse, his headstone visible behind him. But this time, I noticed something else. My aged reflection was smiling, and his eyes held a peace and satisfaction I'd never seen in my own face. The woman in black dress nodded approvingly and gestured one final time toward something beyond the mirror's edge. I made my choice. I've been following the reflections for 3 weeks now, traveling from cemetery to cemetery across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Each burial ground reveals another piece of Abigail Morse's story, another connection in the chain that will eventually lead me to her grave. The work is consuming, obsessive, but also deeply fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. I am not just researching a single family history anymore. I am uncovering the stories of dozens of forgotten people, preserving their memories, ensuring their lives aren't completely lost to time. And with each cemetery I visit, I age a little faster, just as the mirror showed me I would. My hair is already showing more gray than it should after just 3 weeks. The lines around my eyes are deepening, and I move with the careful deliberation of someone older than my actual years. But I don't feel cursed or trapped. I feel chosen, selected for work that is more important than anything I've ever done. Patricia Caldwell calls sometimes, asking about my progress. I tell her I'm getting close, that I've found some promising leads. She seems satisfied with these updates, though I suspect she knows more about the true nature of this search than she initially let on. Because I'm beginning to understand that Patricia Caldwell might not be a descendant of Abigail Morse at all. She might be something else entirely, someone who has been guiding researchers to Hollow Ground Cemetery for decades, ensuring that Abigail's story continues to be sought. Her final rest continues to be pursued. The mirror gate reflects more than just the future. It reflects purpose, destiny, the path that each visitor is meant to follow. Some people see nothing but their normal reflection because their path doesn't lead through cemeteries and forgotten graves. But for those of us called to this work, the gate shows exactly where we need to go. I know how this story ends now. I've seen it in that polished surface. In 40 years, I'll stand in a cemetery I don't yet recognize, having finally found Abigail Morse's grave and completed the work she set me to do. I'll die peacefully among the headstones, my purpose fulfilled, my name added to the long list of researchers who gave their lives to preserve the stories of the dead. And someday, another genealogist will come to Hollow Ground Cemetery, looking into that mirror gate and seeing reflections that will guide them toward whatever unfinished business awaits among the forgotten graves of Appalachia. The dead have their own plans, their own needs, their own ways of ensuring they were never completely forgotten. The mirror gate simply makes those plans visible to those willing to see. Story 9. Gatlinburg Witch. This bird skull mask. I still wake up scratching at my arms, feeling those invisible scars burning into my skin. It's been 3 months since White Oak Flats Cemetery, and I can shake the memory of that bird skull staring back at me through hollow sockets that seem to hold the weight of 1,000 lost souls. You need to understand something about me first. I am not the type who believes in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. I am a 42-year-old insurance adjuster from Nashville, and I deal in facts, evidence, and reasonable explanations. I went to Gatlinburg that October weekend for one reason: to photograph historic cemeteries for a client, his genealogy research. Nothing more, nothing less. White Oak Flats Cemetery sits on the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains, forgotten by most tourists who flock to the area for the theme parks and moonshine distilleries. The cemetery dates back to the early 1800s, when Gatlinburg was still called White Oak Flats. What makes this place particularly unsettling is not just its age, but its mystery. Over 1,000 people are buried there, but only a handful of graves bear readable headstones. The rest are unmarked mounds of earth, their occupants lost to time and poor record-keeping. I arrived just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows between the weathered headstones. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees from the afternoon, and my breath came out in small puffs as I unpacked my camera equipment. I planned to take some atmospheric shots in the dying light, then return in the morning for the detailed documentation my client needed. That's when I first saw her. She was standing at the far end of the cemetery, near the rusted iron fence that separated the burial ground from the dense forest beyond. Even from a distance, something about her appearance made my skin crawl. She was impossibly tall and thin, draped in what looked like a tattered gray cloak that seemed to move independently of any wind. But it was her face that stopped me cold. Where a human face should have been, there was instead the bleached white skull of a large bird. The hollow eye sockets were black voids that seemed to drink in the fading daylight. The long, curved beak pointed downward like an accusing finger. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim light. When I looked again, she was gone. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Perhaps it was just a mourner in dark clothing, and the bird skull was merely a trick of shadows and distance. But as I set up my tripod, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong about this place. The first few photographs came out normally. Weathered headstones, gnarled oak trees, the typical imagery you'd expect from an old mountain cemetery. But as full darkness settled over the graveyard, my camera began picking up things my naked eye couldn't see. In the LCD screen on the back of my camera, I could make out a faint figure moving between the headstones. At first, I thought it was just digital noise or a reflection, but the figure had purpose. It was walking slowly along the fence line, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. I zoomed in and took another shot. The flash illuminated the entire cemetery for a split second, and in that brief moment of white light, I saw her clearly. The bird skull mask was definitely real, fashioned from what looked like the skull of a large hawk or eagle. But what made my stomach lurch were the scars covering every inch of exposed skin on her arms and neck. They weren't old scars from accidents or injuries. These were fresh, deliberate cuts arranged in intricate patterns. Some formed symbols I didn't recognize, while others spelled out letters in an alphabet that seemed older than English. The cuts were precise, methodical, as if they served some ritualistic purpose. I lowered my camera and tried to call out to her, thinking perhaps she needed help. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. The air itself seemed to have grown thick, pressing against my throat like invisible hands. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees in seconds, and frost began forming on the metal fence posts around me. That's when I heard the scratching. It started as a faint sound, like fingernails on wood, coming from somewhere beneath my feet. I looked down and realized I was standing directly over one of the unmarked graves. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way up from 6 feet underground. The sound spread. Soon, scratching noises were coming from dozens of graves throughout the cemetery. The unmarked ones were the loudest, their occupants seemingly more desperate to break free from their forgotten resting places. I could hear dirt shifting, roots snapping, and something that sounded disturbingly like muffled screaming. I stepped back from the grave beneath my feet, but the scratching followed me. Every unmarked mound I passed began producing the same desperate clawing sounds. It was as if my presence had awakened something that had been sleeping for decades, or perhaps centuries. The figure in the bird skull mask had stopped walking. She now stood perfectly still about 50 feet away, facing directly toward me. The hollow eye sockets of her mask seemed to be studying me with an intelligence that was both ancient and malevolent. Slowly, she raised one scarred arm and pointed at me with a finger that appeared to be missing flesh down to the bone. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. Each step required enormous effort, and I could feel something tugging at my ankles, as if hands were reaching up from the graves to pull me down. The scratching sounds intensified, and I could swear I heard voices calling my name from beneath the earth. The bird skull woman began walking toward me again, but her movement was all wrong. Her feet never seemed to touch the ground, and her body swayed side to side like she was suspended from invisible strings. As she got closer, I could see more details of her horrific appearance. The scars on her arms weren't random. They formed a map of some kind, with lines connecting various points on her skin. Some of the deeper cuts still wept a dark substance that wasn't quite blood. The symbols carved into her flesh seemed to pulse with their own light, growing brighter as she approached. But it was her cloak that truly terrified me. What I had initially mistaken for gray fabric was actually human skin, sewn together from dozens of different sources. I could make out variations in skin tone, texture, and age. Some pieces bore tattoos or birthmarks, personal identifiers of people who had once worn this skin themselves. I finally managed to break free from whatever force was holding my legs and stumbled toward my car. But as I ran, the bird skull woman's voice echoed through the cemetery, though I never saw her mouth move beneath the mask. The voice was layered, as if 1,000 different people were speaking in unison. They were all saying the same thing, over and over. We cannot remember who we are. We cannot remember who we were. Help us remember. Help us remember. I reached my car and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. In my rearview mirror, I could see the entire cemetery was now alive with movement. Dozens of figures were rising from the unmarked graves, their faces obscured by shadows but their movements mirroring that same unnatural, puppet-like gait. I drove away faster than I had ever driven in my life, not stopping until I reached the bright lights of downtown Gatlinburg. I checked into the first motel I found and spent the rest of the night with every light on, trying to convince myself that what I had experienced was some kind of hallucination brought on by stress or altitude. But when I developed the photographs the next day, the truth was undeniable. Every single image showed the bird skull woman in the background, always watching, always pointing. In some photos, she was joined by the other figures I had seen rising from their graves. Their faces were visible in the camera flash, and what I saw there still haunts me. They were all different ages, from children to elderly adults, but they shared one common feature. Their eyes were completely white, rolled back as if they were trying to look into their own skulls. And carved into each of their foreheads was the same symbol I had seen on the bird skull woman's arms, a circle with intersecting lines that formed a pattern resembling a spider's web. I researched White Oak Flats Cemetery obsessively for weeks afterward. What I learned made my blood run cold. The cemetery's records were deliberately destroyed in a fire in 1952. But local folklore suggested that many of the unmarked graves contained the remains of people who had died under mysterious circumstances between 1880 and 1920. They called her the Gatlinburg Witch, though no one knew her real name. According to the stories, she was a woman who had practiced some form of mountain magic, offering to help people identify their ancestors or communicate with the dead. But something had gone wrong with her rituals. She became convinced that the spirits were trapped inside her own body, and she began cutting herself in increasingly elaborate patterns, believing that each scar would release another trapped soul. When she was found dead in her cabin in 1901, her body was covered in over 3,000 individual cuts. The authorities buried her in an unmarked grave, along with hundreds of others whose identities had been lost or deliberately obscured. But the mountain folk claimed she never really died. They said she continued to walk the cemetery at night, still trying to identify the lost souls buried there, still cutting herself in the hope of setting them free. The most disturbing part of my research came when I found a newspaper article from 1987. A genealogy researcher from Kentucky had visited White Oak Flats Cemetery to photograph graves for a client. He was found 3 days later in his motel room, dead from what appeared to be self-inflicted wounds. His arms and chest were covered in precise cuts that formed intricate patterns. The symbols carved into his flesh matched exactly what I had seen on the bird skull woman's skin. I tried to dismiss this as coincidence, but then I found more cases. Every few years, someone would visit the cemetery for research purposes and end up dead from ritualistic self-mutilation. The cuts were always the same patterns, always arranged like some kind of map or code that no one could decipher. That's when I noticed the scratches on my own arms. They had appeared gradually over the weeks following my visit to White Oak Flats. At first, I thought they were just from stress or dry skin. But as they multiplied and deepened, I began to recognize the patterns. They were forming the same symbols I had seen carved into the bird skull woman's flesh. I wasn't cutting myself. The scars were appearing on their own, as if something inside my skin was trying to claw its way out. Each new mark brought with it a fragment of memory that wasn't my own. I began to remember things that had never happened to me. Walking through mountain forests in the 1800s, working in mines that had been closed for decades, speaking languages I had never learned. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The bird skull woman wasn't just releasing spirits from her own body. She was collecting them. Every person who visited that cemetery became a repository for the lost souls buried in those unmarked graves. We became living vessels for the dead who could not remember their own identities. I tried everything to stop the process. I saw doctors, psychiatrists, even a few people who claimed to practice mountain magic themselves. Nothing worked. The scars continued to appear, and with each new mark came another fragment of someone else's life, someone else's death, someone else's desperate need to be remembered. I can feel them all now, over 1,000 lost souls living inside my body, each one trying to scratch their way back to the surface of my consciousness. They whisper their stories to me at night, fragments of lives lived and forgotten in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. Some were miners who died in cave-ins. Others were children who succumbed to diseases that no longer have names. Many were people who simply disappeared one day and were buried without ceremony in unmarked plots. They all want the same thing: to be identified, to be remembered, to have their stories told. And I understand now that this is my purpose. The bird skull woman didn't choose me randomly. She chose me because I work in documentation, in preserving records and identifying the forgotten. I'm writing this account as a warning to others, but also as a record. If something happens to me, if I am found dead with ritualistic cuts covering my body, know that it wasn't suicide or madness. It was completion. The spirits inside me will have finally found their way back to the surface, and perhaps they will finally remember who they were. The scratching never stops now. It's constant, day and night, like 1,000 fingernails clawing at the inside of my skin. Sometimes I catch myself standing in front of mirrors, studying my reflection, looking for signs of the people living inside me. I see flashes of other faces superimposed over my own. A young woman with coal dust in her hair, an elderly man with hands stained by decades of tobacco farming, children whose eyes hold the wisdom of lives cut tragically short. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I see her, the bird skull woman, standing behind me in the mirror, her hollow eye sockets filled with a satisfaction that chills me to the bone. She nods approvingly at the scars covering my arms, at the symbols that continue to appear on my chest and back, at the slow transformation of my body into a living monument to the forgotten dead. I know what is coming. I can feel it building like a storm in the mountains. Soon, the pressure will become too much to bear, and I'll find myself picking up a knife, not to harm myself but to complete the ritual that began the moment I stepped foot in White Oak Flats Cemetery. Each cut will release another spirit, another story, another identity back into the world. And when it is over, when my body is covered in the same intricate patterns that marked the Gatlinburg witch, I'll join her in that eternal walk along the cemetery fence. I'll become another guardian of the forgotten, helping to identify the lost souls who rest in those unmarked graves. But until then, I scratch. And I remember, and I tell their stories, one scar at a time. The bird skull woman is calling to me now. I can hear her voice echoing through the walls of my Nashville apartment. That layered whisper of 1,000 souls speaking in unison. We remember now. We remember who we are. Thank you for helping us remember. And as the scratching beneath my skin grows more insistent, as the scars multiply and deepen, I realize that I'm not the victim in this story. I am the solution. Story 10. Ring bearer. As promised, the ring appeared on the angel's finger again last night, and this time I watched it happen. My name is David, and I am the groundskeeper at Fairview Cemetery in the hills of eastern Kentucky. I've been working these grounds for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything that could happen in a place where the dead are supposed to rest peacefully. I was wrong. It started 3 months ago when Mrs. Henderson called me hysterical, claiming someone had broken into her grandson's grave. Tommy Henderson had been buried just 2 weeks earlier after a motorcycle accident on Route 27. 24 years old, supposed to marry his high school sweetheart Sarah the following month. Instead of a wedding ring, he went into the ground wearing the engagement ring he bought for her. When I met Mrs. Henderson at Tommy's grave that morning, I expected to find signs of vandalism or grave robbery. Instead, the headstone was untouched, the flowers perfectly arranged, and the earth showed no signs of disturbance. But Mrs. Henderson insisted something was wrong. She kept pointing at the marble angel statue about 30 feet away, the one that marks the old Whitaker family plot from the 1800s. The angel stands 8 feet tall, wings spread wide, one hand pointing skyward and the other extended as if offering comfort to mourners. It's been there since 1887, weathered by over a century of mountain storms. But that morning, something was different. On the angel's outstretched finger sat a simple gold band with a small diamond. Tommy's engagement ring. I assumed some sick joke was being played on the grieving family. Grave robbery, I said, unheard of, even in small Appalachian towns. I climbed up and removed the ring, returning it to Mrs. Henderson with promises to increase security patrols. She took the ring but wouldn't. He stopped staring at the angel's hand. She said the marble looked different where the ring had been, darker somehow, like it was stained. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time it was Sarah, Tommy's fiancée, who called me. She visited his grave to leave fresh flowers and found it empty-handed again. The ring was back on the angel's finger, and when I climbed up to retrieve it, I noticed Mrs. Henderson had been right. The marble around the angel's ring finger was definitely darker now, almost black, like the stone had been burned or corroded. Sarah was barely holding herself together. She kept asking how someone could be cruel enough to keep disturbing Tommy's rest, to keep stealing the ring she'd chosen with him. I promised to install motion-activated cameras around both the grave and the angel statue. Whoever was doing this would be caught. The third time, the cameras caught nothing. I reviewed every frame from the night the ring disappeared and reappeared. At 11:47 p.m., the ring was clearly visible in the video of Tommy's grave, glinting in the infrared light. At 3:23 a.m., it was gone, but the cameras showed no one approaching the grave, no disturbance of any kind. The ring had simply vanished. The cameras monitoring the angel statue were even more disturbing. At 3:23 a.m., the exact moment the ring vanished from the grave, the angel's outstretched hand was empty. At 3:24 a.m., the ring was there, sitting perfectly on the marble finger as if it had materialized out of thin air. I watched that footage dozens of times, looking for any explanation. Camera malfunction, digital glitch, anything that made sense. But the timestamp was continuous, and everything else in the frame remained normal. Only the ring had moved 30 feet through solid earth and stone, with no visible cause. That is when I started researching the angel statue itself. The cemetery's records go back to its founding in 1823, but the angel wasn't installed until 1887 by Theodore Whitaker to mark his family plot. Whitaker had been a wealthy merchant who lost his only son, Marcus, in a hunting accident. The boy was 19, engaged to be married to a local girl named Elizabeth Conway. Like Tommy Henderson, Marcus died just months before his wedding day. The parallels were unsettling, but I told myself it was just coincidence. Young men died in accidents throughout history. The fact that both were engaged meant nothing. Then I found the newspaper clipping from 1888. The Pikeville Register ran a small item about vandalism at Fairview Cemetery. Someone had been disturbing Marcus Whitaker's grave repeatedly, and valuable items were disappearing from the burial site. The article mentioned that the missing items kept appearing elsewhere in the cemetery, specifically near the new angel monument Theodore Whitaker had commissioned for his son. The article was brief, but it mentioned one crucial detail. Marcus Whitaker had been buried with his fiancée, his engagement ring, just like Tommy Henderson. I spent the next week digging through historical records and old newspapers. What I found made my blood run cold. The pattern went back over a century. Every few decades, a young man would die shortly before his wedding day and be buried with his fiancée, his engagement ring. And every time, the ring would disappear from the grave and appear on the angel's outstretched finger. 2007. And now Tommy Henderson in 2024. Each incident followed the same pattern. The ring would disappear and reappear 3 times over several months, then stop. The families would eventually give up trying to keep the ring in the grave, assuming grave robbers had finally moved on to easier targets. But I was starting to understand the truth was far stranger and more terrifying. I decided to spend a night in the cemetery, positioned where I could watch both Tommy's grave and the angel statue. I brought night vision equipment, cameras, and enough coffee to stay alert until dawn. If something supernatural was happening, I was going to document it. The cemetery at night is a different world. During the day, it is peaceful, almost comforting. Families visit, children play between the headstones, and life continues around the constant reminder of mortality. But at night, the place feels heavy, oppressive, like the weight of all that accumulated grief has settled into the ground itself. I positioned myself behind a large mausoleum with a clear view of both locations. The night was clear and cold, typical for November in Kentucky. A thin layer of frost covered the grass, making every footstep visible. If anyone approached either grave, I would see them coming from hundreds of yards away. At 11:30 p.m., I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. But there was no wind, and the nearest house was over a mile away. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the angel statue, a soft, musical tinkling that reminded me of laughter. But not happy laughter. This sound had an edge to it, something bitter and desperate. Through my night vision scope, I watched the angel statue carefully. The marble seemed to be glowing faintly, though I told myself it was just the way the starlight reflected off the pale stone. But as I watched, the glow grew brighter, and I realized it was coming from inside the marble itself. At exactly midnight, the angel moved. Not dramatically, not like in a horror movie. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible. The angel, its outstretched hand turned slightly, rotating at the wrist so the palm faced upward instead of downward. The gesture changed from offering comfort to asking for something, demanding something. The musical sound grew louder, and I realized it wasn't laughter at all. It was sobbing. Someone was crying with the desperate, heartbroken sound of inconsolable grief. But the crying seemed to come from beneath the ground, from the graves themselves. I turned my scope toward Tommy's grave and saw something that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the equipment. The earth above his coffin was moving, not like something was digging up from below, but like it was breathing. The ground rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, and with each movement, the sound of crying grew louder. At 12:15 a.m., I saw him. Marcus Whitaker stood beside his family, this angel monument, exactly as he would have looked in 1887. He was wearing a dark suit, the kind young men wore to formal occasions in the 19th century. But his face was wrong. His skin was gray as ash, and his eyes were black holes that seemed to swallow light. He wasn't alone. Other figures emerged from the darkness between the headstones, all young men, all wearing the clothes of their respective eras. I recognized the style of each decade I researched. 1923, 1954, 1981, 2007. All of them dead before their wedding days, all of them buried with their fiancés, rings, all of them bound to this place by promises they could never keep. Marcus approached Tommy's grave and knelt beside the headstone. He pressed his hand against the earth, and the breathing motion stopped. The crying faded to a whisper. Then he reached into the ground as if it were water, his arm disappearing up to the elbow into solid earth. When he pulled his hand back, Tommy's engagement ring glinted between his fingers. The other figures formed a circle around the angel statue as Marcus approached. They were chanting something, but not in English. The words were older, harsher, full of sounds that made my teeth ache. As they chanted, the stain on the angel's finger grew darker, spreading up the marble hand like an infection. Marcus placed the ring on the angel's finger, and the statue, his eyes open. They glowed with the same inner light I'd seen in the marble, but the expression in those stone eyes was unmistakably alive. The angel looked directly at me, even though I was hidden behind the mausoleum. When our eyes met, I felt a crushing weight of sadness, centuries of accumulated grief pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. In that moment, I understood everything. The angel wasn't just a monument. It was a prison, a binding place for all the young men who had died with unfulfilled promises. Marcus Whitaker, his father, had commissioned it after his son's death, but something had gone wrong with the blessing or consecration. Instead of providing peace, the statue had become a trap, drawing in every young man who died in similar circumstances. Each ring represented a promise that could never be kept, a vow that death had made impossible to fulfill. The rings didn't just disappear from the graves. They were taken by the spirits of the dead, offered to the angel as tokens of their eternal frustration and grief. The angel fed on that grief, grew stronger with each new soul it claimed. The stain on its finger wasn't to tarnish from the rings. It was the accumulated sorrow of over a century of broken promises seeping into the marble itself. But there was something else, something that terrified me more than the supernatural implications. As I watched the ghostly figures surrounding the angel, I realized Tommy Henderson wasn't among them yet. He was still in his grave, still fighting the pull of the statue. The other spirits were trying to complete his binding, to add him to their eternal gathering. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. The angel's eyes blazed brighter. And from Tommy's grave came a new sound, the voice of a young man screaming in terror and rage, fighting against forces he couldn't understand or defeat. I had to do something. I left my hiding place and walked directly toward the circle of spirits. They turned to face me, their black eyes reflecting no light, their faces twisted with centuries of frustrated longing. Marcus Whitaker stepped forward, his mouth opening to speak, but no sound emerged except the rustle of dry leaves. I reached the angel statue and climbed up, grabbing the ring from its outstretched finger. The moment I touched the gold band, pain shot through my arm like electricity. Visions flashed through my mind, images of every young man who had died with promises unfulfilled, every fiancé left waiting at the altar, every family destroyed by unexpected tragedy. But I held on, fighting through the pain and grief. I could feel the angel trying to claim me too, trying to add my own regrets and failures to its collection of bound souls. I had never married, never found the courage to propose to the woman I loved in my 20s, never risked the vulnerability of complete commitment to another person. The angel whispered in my mind, promising that I could join the others, that I could know what it felt like to be truly needed, truly mourned, truly missed. All I had to do was let go, surrender to the grief, and become part of something larger than my solitary existence. For a moment, I almost gave in, but then I thought about Sarah, Tommy, his fiancée, still visiting his grave every week with fresh flowers. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, keeping vigil over her grandson, his memory. I thought about all the people who loved these young men, who needed them to rest peacefully instead of being trapped in an eternal cycle of supernatural suffering. I jumped down from the statue and ran toward Tommy's grave. The spirits followed, their chanting becoming a howl of rage and desperation. I could feel the angel, his power pulling at me, trying to drag me back, but I kept moving. At Tommy's headstone, I pressed the ring into the earth above his coffin. The ground was soft, yielding, and I pushed the ring as deep as I could reach. As soon as the gold touched the coffin wood below, the howling stopped. The spirits froze in place, their forms becoming translucent. Marcus Whitaker looked at me with something that might have been gratitude before he faded away completely. The others followed, dissolving into the pre-dawn darkness like smoke. The angel, his eyes closed, and the inner light faded from the marble. For the first time in over a century, the statue looked like nothing more than carved stone, beautiful but lifeless. I stayed in the cemetery until sunrise, waiting to see if anything else would happen. But the morning brought only normal sounds, birds singing and traffic from the distant highway. The supernatural weight that had pressed down on the place for decades was gone. That was 6 months ago. Tommy, this ring has never moved again. The stain on the angel's finger has begun to fade, and the marble is slowly returning to its original white color. Sarah still visits the grave, but she smiles sometimes now when she tends to the flowers. Mrs. Henderson says she finally feels like her grandson is truly at rest. I never told anyone what really happened that night. Who would believe such a story? But I keep watching, keep maintaining the grounds, keep ensuring that the dead stay peacefully buried. Because I learned something important during those terrible hours in the cemetery. Love doesn't end with death, but sometimes it can become twisted, corrupted by grief and regret until it becomes something harmful to both the living and the dead. The angel statue still stands in Fairview Cemetery, but now it is just a monument again, a beautiful reminder of love that transcends mortality. The promises carved into its base speak of eternal devotion and reunion in a better place. But I know the truth. Some promises are too heavy for the dead to carry, and sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to let go. The living have to release the dead, and the dead have to release the living. Only then can anyone truly rest in peace. You've made it back from another Appalachian cemetery story, at least for tonight. If you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications to keep the lantern lit. Drop your location or your own graveyard experience in the comments below. The path out is narrow, and the dark has a way of following you home.